A lone knight stands amidst the smoldering ruins of a village that had once breathed with life. The air is thick, clinging to his lungs, a bitter mixture of smoke, ash, and the metallic tang of blood. Charred beams jut from collapsed homes like the ribs of some fallen beast, and the ground is littered with remnants of shattered lives. Splintered carts, scorched cooking pots, and the forgotten toys of children who will never return to these streets. His armor, once gleaming with the promise of honor, is now dulled, streaked with grime and streaked with crimson. Each dent and scratch tells the tale of battles fought, of lives taken, and of the silent, invisible toll exacted on the soul. He moves slowly, the weight of his sword dragging at his side as if it too has absorbed the anguish of the day. Every step crunches on the broken earth, every movement stirring the smoke into a swirling haze around him. He pauses at the threshold of a burned-out home, peering inside at a charred hearth. Once, this place would have been filled with the laughter of a family, the aroma of bread baking, the warmth of a fire against a cold evening. Now it is silent. Even the wind seems reluctant to pass through these streets, as though it fears to disturb the ghosts that linger in the shadows. The cries of the fallen haunt him, not just the immediate screams of terror that echoed during the attack, but the imagined voices of those who once lived here, their lives reduced to nothing more than ash and memory. They rise unbidden in his mind, a chorus of sorrow and accusation. He hears the soft, anguished sobs of a mother, the quiet pleading of a child reaching out in vain, the gurgle of a man's last breath as he clutched at the earth beneath him. Each sound intertwines with the crackling of fire and the distant clang of metal from some survivor scavenging what remains. And in this cacophony of death, he realizes that the stories of valor he had once held close, the songs sung of knights and glory, are but fragile lies, easily shattered in the presence of true devastation. He falls to his knees amidst the ruin, the jagged stones digging into his palms, the heat of embers searing the soles of his boots. He closes his eyes and bows his head, not in triumph, but in mourning. His prayer is silent, a trembling, wordless offering to the souls whose lives were extinguished here. The wind stirs, carrying with it a fine layer of ash that brushes against his face like the faint touch of a hand. In that moment, he feels a connection not to victory, but to loss, an understanding that lingers heavy in the hollow of his chest. War is not a dance of chivalry or a path to immortal fame. It is a crucible of endurance, a test of what it means to survive when everything else has been stripped away. As he kneels, his thoughts wander to the choices that brought him here. Each decision, each command obeyed in the name of duty, now weighs like chains upon him. He remembers the faces of his comrades, those who had marched alongside him into the unknown, whose courage and laughter had once been a shield against despair. Some lie here among the ruins, others remain, haunted and hollow-eyed, carrying the invisible wounds that no blade can sever. The knight feels the sting of guilt, bitter as the smoke that fills the air. He wonders if the cost of survival is ever truly worth the price paid in blood and innocence. The flames crackle, their tongues of fire licking the sky, and for a fleeting moment, he allows himself to see the beauty within the destruction. Shadows dance across scorched walls, flickering like spirits seeking solace. The smoke twists and coils, painting ghostly images of the lives that once were. There is a solemn poetry to it, a reminder that even amidst ruin, life's imprint remains, stubborn and defiant. And yet, the fleeting grace is pierced by the harsh reality of what has been lost. Trust, safety, the illusion that order and justice are permanent. Here, only survival endures, as fleeting and fragile as the smoke that drifts toward the heavens. He rises slowly, the weight of his sword suddenly familiar, a companion through years of relentless conflict. His hands, rough and calloused, grip it not with anticipation of honor, but with the knowledge that it is both shield and burden. Each breath he takes is measured, steadying himself against the tide of despair that threatens to overwhelm. Around him, the village whispers in silence, the echo of what was and what could have been. And in that quiet, he feels the seed of understanding taking root. An unspoken vow to bear witness, to survive, to honor those who cannot. A small flicker catches his eye, a fragment of a tattered banner, half-burned but still clinging to its pole. It flutters weakly in the smoke-choked wind, a reminder that even in devastation, symbols endure. The knight steps forward, reaching out to straighten it, and in that simple gesture, he finds a semblance of purpose. War has revealed its true face, not the grand tales sung by bards or etched into stone, but the raw, painful truth of survival, sacrifice, and the quiet, stubborn persistence of the human spirit. As he surveys the wreckage once more, a thought forms unbidden, heavy and profound. This land, scarred and bleeding, will remember. The lives lost here will echo through the halls of memory, carried by those who remain to tell the tale. And the knight, bloodied and weary, understands that his role is no longer to seek glory, but to bear witness, to carry forward the weight of what has been endured, and to ensure that even in silence, the fallen are never forgotten. He walks slowly away, each step careful, deliberate, tracing paths through the ashes where homes and dreams once stood. The wind swirls around him, carrying with it the faint, haunting scent of smoke and pine, of earth scorched and soil unsettled. In the distance, the faint outline of another village rises through the morning mist, untouched yet unaware of the horrors that may come. And as he disappears into the pale light of dawn, the memory of this place clings to him, a shadow stitched into the fabric of his soul. War is not about banners or songs. It is about the weight we bear, the lives we touch, and the fragile hope that, even in ruin, some part of us endures. The castle loomed above them like a stone sentinel, its jagged towers clawing at the sky. Shadows pooled in the narrow alleyways below, swallowing the clatter of armored feet and the low hum of anxious voices. The morning air was thick with fog, clinging to the squire's skin like cold sweat, and carrying the faint scent of iron and horse. Every step he took echoed against the stone walls, each footfall a reminder that he was no longer merely a boy with dreams of glory. He was a witness to what awaited beyond the walls. His mentor moved with a measured precision, the seasoned knight's armor gleaming dully in the weak sunlight that pierced the mist. Each strap tightened, each gauntlet clicked into place with the authority of habit. The squire watched, heart hammering, the reflection of steel and leather dancing in his wide, untrained eyes. He had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed the heroic words he would speak, the brave deeds he would perform, but the reality pressed down on him like the weight of the castle itself. The murmur of soldiers rose around him, a living tide of tension and readiness. Some whispered prayers to gods unseen, their lips moving in silent supplication. Others tightened their grips on spears and shields, eyes darting to the horizon where smoke already began to curl from the enemy's encampment. The squire's chest ached with anticipation and fear, a wild thrum that threatened to burst from his ribcage. He wanted to step forward, to show that he too could bear the weight of the sword, but he felt rooted, trapped in the moment before the storm. Then the horn sounded, a deep, resonant call that split the fog and made the walls tremble. Armor clanged as knights surged forward, hooves striking stone and earth in unison, and the squire followed, heart lurching with every step. The world narrowed to the rhythm of marching men, the whistle of arrows, the far-off crack of crossbows. The battle was a living, breathing beast, its breath a mix of smoke, sweat, and blood. The young squire thought he understood courage, but now he felt only the raw, unfiltered terror of being alive in a moment designed to snuff life out. He saw men fall, not as heroes in stories, but as flesh and bone breaking, screams tearing from throats too young or too old to bear the horror. Each cry struck him like a hammer, each body toppled a silent accusation. Innocence is fragile here, and the price of glory is counted in the currency of life. His mentor's sword swung with the precision of countless campaigns, a flash of silver against the gray sky. Yet even mastery could not protect him from the chaos. A cry, a scream that ripped through the fog drew the squire's gaze. There, amid the writhing bodies and the churned earth, lay the man who had guided him, the man whose voice had once been a steady current in the storm. Now motionless, blood soaking the ground beneath him, he was a testament to the unforgiving truth of war. The squire froze, a cold wave of disbelief washing over him. He wanted to run, to deny the scene before his eyes, but his legs trembled and stayed rooted in the mud. Around him, the battle surged forward, indifferent to grief, indifferent to fear. He could see the life in men flickering like torches in a sudden wind, snuffed out before their stories could be told. The screams and clangs became a blurred rhythm, each moment folding into the next, until time itself seemed to fracture. He realized that valor was not measured in triumph, but in survival, and survival exacted a price the heart was rarely prepared to pay. The squire's mind spun with questions that had no answers. Why must courage be bought with such anguish? Why did the strongest fall so easily while the weak were swept aside by fortune's cruel tide? He looked at the mud-streaked faces of those still fighting, at the hollow eyes and shaking hands, and understood, in a way no tale or teaching could have conveyed, the fragile thread upon which life hung. His mentor had embodied honor and strength, but now he was proof that even legends could bleed, that even the mighty could fall to the indifferent hand of fate. And yet, amid the horror, a faint pulse of resolve stirred within him. The squire saw the faces of those who fought not for glory but for kin, for village, for survival. He felt the rhythm of the march, the heartbeat of humanity pressing onward through mud and blood, and it called to something deep within him. Perhaps courage was not in slaying foes or winning battles, but in standing, even when all the world demanded surrender. Perhaps the true measure of a knight was not in vanquishing enemies, but in witnessing the cost of war and carrying its memory forward. Smoke curled from the distant tree-line, the acrid scent pricking his nose, and he knew that the battle would not wait for his grief. He tightened his gauntlets, knuckles white beneath the metal, and allowed himself to move forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, burdened with the weight of what he had seen. Yet each step was a claim that innocence, though shattered, could endure in a new form, shaped by the truth of fire and blood. The battlefield was no longer a place of stories and dreams. It was a crucible, testing every measure of spirit, and he would pass through it whether he wished to or not. The clang of swords and shields rose again, a symphony of chaos that threatened to drown him. Yet in that clamor, he caught glimpses of courage in its rawest form. A soldier helping a fallen comrade, a knight shielding the weak, eyes meeting across the melee with unspoken oaths of loyalty. The squire understood now that war's legacy was not only death. It was the courage that persisted in the face of it, the unyielding pulse of human endurance. He pressed forward, carrying with him the weight of his mentor's memory, the echo of screams, and the quiet promise that he would not let this loss be in vain. As the fog began to lift, revealing the jagged towers of the castle once more, the squire paused for a heartbeat, staring at the blood-soaked earth and the bodies that lay strewn like fallen trees in a storm. The wind carried whispers of mourning and defiance, of prayers and curses, and he let the sound fill him. His eyes traced the horizon, where the battle continued, and for the first time, he saw not just chaos, but a path forward. The squire's innocence had been shattered, but from its shards, something stronger began to grow. A solemn understanding that courage and loss are inseparable, that the heart must endure even when the body trembles, and that the true cost of war is a reckoning of the soul. With one final glance at the fallen knight, his mentor, he whispered a vow, a breath that caught on the wind. To remember, to bear witness, and to carry forward the torch of what it meant to stand, truly, in the shadow of death. The battle raged around him, unrelenting, but the squire, though trembling and scarred, moved into it. Not as a boy dreaming of glory, but as one who had seen the depths of sacrifice and understood the fragile, unyielding essence of life itself. And in that step, uncertain yet resolute, the story of the squire and the man who had shaped him began its next chapter, carried forward on the clamor of steel, the murmur of prayers, and the quiet, enduring heartbeat of survival. The hill rose like a silent sentinel above the battlefield, its rough earth scorched by the setting sun. Shadows stretched long across the blood-stained grass, reaching toward the horizon as if the land itself mourned what was about to unfold. At its crest stood the commander, weathered by years of war, his face carved with the lines of countless campaigns. He breathed in the cool wind, heavy with smoke and the distant cries of men, and felt the pulse of the world beneath him. A pulse of anticipation, fear, and fragile hope. His eyes swept over the army below. Each figure was a story written in sweat and scarred leather, a testament to lives forged and broken in the crucible of loyalty. He saw the young and the old, the eager and the wary, the trembling and the resolute. In their stance, he recognized the weight of their choices, the invisible chains of honor and duty that bound them to this day. The sun, dipping low, set their forms aglow in a burning orange, as though the heavens themselves bore witness to what was to come. For a moment, he closed his eyes and let memory wash over him. Faces rose from the haze of past battles. The boy who had laughed too loudly at campfires now silent beneath the cold soil. The grizzled veteran whose voice once commanded respect now only whispered in the wind. He remembered the clink of armor, the sharp scent of blood mingled with rain, the quiet moments in the night when a shared joke or a nod of understanding had kept despair at bay. Their absence pressed against his chest like a stone, and he swallowed the ache, burying it deep beneath the armor of resolve. The first horns sounded in the distance, low and ominous, carrying a resonance that stirred the gut. The earth trembled with the march of the enemy, and the commander felt it not just in his feet, but in the marrow of his bones. Every footstep a drumbeat of inevitability, every shout a reminder of what they were about to endure. He adjusted the leather strap of his sword, worn smooth by years of grip, and surveyed the formations of his men. Discipline held them together, but only barely. Fear curled at the edges of their courage like smoke rising from a dying fire. He stepped forward, boots sinking into the soft soil, and raised his voice so that it cut through the tense air. Not a shout of command, but a sound laden with conviction, carrying both warning and reassurance. His men turned, their eyes meeting his, and in that instant, the weight of leadership settled fully upon him. It was not the glory of victory he carried. That was a fleeting thing, vanishing with the setting sun. It was the lives entrusted to him, the fallen who had no choice but to follow his orders, and the living who would remember the outcome for the rest of their days. The first clash came like a thunderbolt, sudden and violent. Arrows sang through the air, cutting lines of shadow and light. The clang of steel against steel rang sharp, echoing across the valley like a bell tolling the hour of reckoning. The commander moved among his men, sword flashing, voice calm yet piercing, giving orders that were less about tactics than about survival. Each decision, each command carried a double edge, the hope of victory and the certainty of sacrifice. He felt the presence of the dead with him, as if their spirits walked beside him, whispering warnings and lending strength in equal measure. Hours passed, though time had fractured into moments of chaos and clarity. Mud clung to boots and armor, blood to hands and faces, mixing indistinguishably with the sweat and dust of exertion. Men screamed, some with anger, some with despair, some in the wordless terror of seeing a comrade fall. The commander's eyes never wavered, yet inside, a storm raged. Every life lost was a dagger in his heart, each victory a bitter sweetness against the cost of survival. He remembered a friend, shoulder to shoulder beside him once, whose laughter had filled the cold nights, now silent. The memory sharpened his resolve, demanding that he lead not with pride, but with the solemn promise that their sacrifice would not be in vain. By twilight, the tide began to turn. The enemy faltered, lines breaking under the weight of relentless resolve. The commander pressed forward, voice low and steady, guiding the living over the fallen, urging them to hold, to fight, to endure. He could feel the exhaustion seeping into every joint, every muscle, yet a strange clarity accompanied it. Leadership was not the thrill of victory, nor the pride in strategy executed flawlessly. It was the quiet, unbearable act of shouldering grief, of seeing the faces of the lost and moving forward anyway. Each decision was a promise to those who could no longer speak, to honor them with survival, with the stubborn persistence of the living. Night began to descend, a blanket of shadows and cold, the battlefield now a tableau of flickering torches and smoldering embers. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the scent of iron. Silence settled unevenly over the broken landscape, punctuated by distant cries and the crackle of dying fires. The commander lowered his gaze, surveying what remained of his men and what lay behind in memory. Victory was theirs, but it was carved from the marrow of loss, painted in the quiet screams of the fallen. He felt the weight of their absence pressing against him like a shroud, yet within it, a fragile ember of hope flickered. He sheathed his sword, the metal whispering softly in the night, and raised his eyes to the horizon where the moon began to crown the darkened sky. There was no jubilation, only a deep, tremulous understanding that survival itself was a gift earned in blood and sorrow. In the distance, he thought he saw the faint outlines of new challenges yet to come, a reminder that the world would not pause for grief, and that the mantle of command never truly left him. With a breath that tasted of iron and smoke, he stepped forward, leading his men not toward glory, but toward the fragile, enduring promise of another dawn. The chamber was cloaked in shadows, the faint glow of torchlight trembling against the cold stone walls. Maps lay splayed across the wooden table, scrolls curled like the coiled breaths of a restless wind. Smoke from the hearth mingled with the scent of wet leather and iron, a reminder that even here, in this dim sanctuary, the world outside was waiting, impatient, merciless. Knights huddled around the table, their faces etched with lines carved by years of battle, eyes hollowed by the knowledge of the lives they had already spent, and those they would inevitably lose. The room vibrated with a silence so taut it could be sliced with a dagger. Hands drummed lightly against the wood, fingers tracing the curves of rivers and ridges on the parchment. Each mark represented more than a mountain or a forest. It represented danger, strategy, and the weight of decisions that could tilt the balance between life and death. The commander, a man whose age had sharpened both his mind and his caution, leaned over the table, his shadow long against the wall. He spoke little, yet every word he had uttered over the years carried the gravity of storms and sieges past. Now he listened. A stir came from the edge of the table, small and hesitant. The youngest knight, barely more than a boy in the eyes of the seasoned men surrounding him, cleared his throat. His eyes shone with a reckless fervor, the kind that only youth and untested valor can produce. "If we strike at dawn through the northern ridge," he suggested, voice barely rising above the hush of the chamber, "we could flank their forces before they even expect it." The room fell into a silence so absolute that even the crackle of the hearth seemed intrusive. One by one, eyes lifted, measuring the boy, weighing his words against the cost of daring. Courage, after all, was a fine thing, but here it walked hand in hand with folly. The commander's gaze, sharp and unyielding, swept the maps before resting on the young knight. Minutes stretched like hours, the air growing heavier with anticipation. Then, a slow nod, deliberate and final. The plan was accepted. Dawn came with a muted light, the sun struggling to pierce the sky thick with ash and mist. The soldiers moved like shadows through the morning fog, armor clinking softly. The rhythm of their march a heartbeat shared among men who knew the horrors that lay ahead. The young knight rode at the forefront, chest tight with anticipation. A fire ignited within him that blinded him to the whispers of caution that clung to the older warriors around him. He felt the surge of glory before the clash, tasting it like wine upon his lips, unaware of the bitter undertones that awaited. The battle erupted suddenly, a chaos of sound and fury. Steel rang against steel, the cries of men and the screams of the dying creating a symphony of anguish that would haunt the young knight for the rest of his days. He moved with a swiftness that was both instinct and ambition, cutting through the fog of war, guided by the audacious plan that had earned him approval. Yet each step forward brought with it a shadow, a reminder that every choice carried a price. The ridge, so carefully plotted on the map, became a theater of carnage. Men fell on either side, their blood seeping into the earth, darkening the soil as if the land itself mourned the cost of ambition. The young knight's eyes widened as he saw the cost of his suggestion laid bare. Faces he had admired, comrades who had shared stories by the fire and sweated in the mud beside him, were torn from life in moments that felt endless. The clash of ideals and reality struck him like a hammer to the chest. Courage was not enough. Glory demanded tribute, and the ledger was always written in blood. The commander's voice, rising above the din, was both command and lament, guiding the survivors, but never shielding them from the truth. The folly of pride is cruel, and it spares none. In the swirl of smoke and iron, the young knight felt the weight of mortality pressing against his chest, the warmth of life slipping through his fingers. He had imagined heroism as a blaze, brilliant and unyielding. Now he understood it as a flicker, fragile and easily extinguished. He moved among the wounded, the fallen, the echo of screams still ringing in his ears, each life a testament to the razor-thin line that separates bravery from recklessness. The dawn he had so eagerly awaited seemed distant, as though the world itself recoiled from the devastation wrought in its fragile light. Hours passed, though time lost meaning beneath the shadow of so much death. The young knight, once buoyed by pride, now knelt amid the ruin of his own ambition. Hands stained with mud and blood, he traced the faces of those who would never rise again, and for the first time, he understood the true weight of command, the silent cost borne by those who dare to choose. He whispered a prayer, or perhaps an apology, the words lost to the wind, swallowed by the chaos that had consumed the morning. Night fell slowly, drawing a velvet curtain across the scarred battlefield. Torches flickered among the tents, casting long shadows that danced across the faces of men too weary to mourn, too stunned to celebrate. The young knight sat at the edge of the fire, the warmth failing to reach the cold that had settled into his bones. Pride, he realized, was a double-edged sword, and ambition a perilous companion. Those who wield it without foresight paid a toll no map could chart, no strategy could mitigate. And yet, amidst the ruin, there was a quiet lesson in the dark. Courage and folly, bravery and hubris, existed not in isolation but entwined, like twin branches of the same gnarled tree. The young knight's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the first hints of dawn bled into the sky, fragile and tentative. Somewhere beyond this night, beyond the tolling of lives lost and victories claimed, another choice awaited, another battle, another chance to measure the heart against the cost of desire. He understood now that history is written not only in the triumphs of the bold, but in the silence of those who survive to remember the price. The commander approached, his face a mask of endurance and sorrow. Without words, he placed a hand upon the young knight's shoulder, an acknowledgment that spoke more than any speech could. In that touch lay both reprimand and guidance, a silent imparting of wisdom forged in years of fire and blood. The boy, once blinded by his own ambition, now felt the tremor of understanding. The path of a knight was narrow, fraught with peril, and lit by the faintest glimmers of insight. Every step forward would carry the memory of this day, the echo of those voices silenced, the weight of choices made in the heat of desire and the storm of battle. As the night deepened, a quiet wind whispered through the camp, stirring the ashes of torches and carrying the scent of rain and mud. The young knight lifted his eyes to the horizon, where darkness met the first stirrings of light, and he understood the fragile balance of life and death, pride and humility. Tomorrow would demand courage once more, but now tempered with knowledge. Glory, he realized, was fleeting. Wisdom, if earned, endured. And somewhere in the silence between heartbeats, he felt the stirrings of a resolve that would guide him, not to reckless triumph, but to a measured courage, the kind that honors the fallen and tempers the living. The battlefield slept under the watch of a pale moon, the land scarred yet enduring, and the young knight, kneeling among the quiet echoes of the day, knew that the line between courage and folly is thin indeed, and that pride, once unleashed, is always measured in blood. The battlefield was a wasteland of smoke and shadow, where the morning mist clung to the ground like a shroud over the dead. A coppery tang of blood hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of fire and sweat. Amidst the chaos, she moved with a calm precision that belied the terror surrounding her. Every step was deliberate, her boots sinking into the mud turned slick with rain and ruin, yet her gaze never wavered. She was a healer, and here, in the heart of devastation, she was both a witness and a savior. Around her, the wounded writhed in silence or agony. Groans echoed across the field like whispers of despair, each one a plea to the gods or the fates. She knelt beside a young man whose arm had been torn in the fury of combat. His eyes, wide and uncomprehending, searched for something beyond the pain, and she pressed her hands to the wound, murmuring words that were half prayer, half incantation. The poultices she carried were simple, humble things, herbs crushed and boiled, cloths soaked in healing oils. But in her hands they became instruments of resistance against death itself. As she worked, she became acutely aware of each face, each story abruptly halted. A boy barely grown, with dreams no one would ever hear whispered in the quiet of a home. Another, eyes closed, mouth frozen in the memory of a scream that would never be answered. She touched their foreheads, feeling the heat of fever, the chill of shock, the strange stillness of life slipping away. And each one carried a weight she could not ignore, a silent indictment of the war that had stolen so much from the living and the dead alike. Time had become meaningless here. Minutes stretched into hours, each one punctuated by the metallic tang of blood on her hands and the harsh cries of soldiers torn between survival and terror. the world outside the battlefield. A sunlit village, a quiet forest, laughter shared over bread, seemed a memory from another life, as if war had swallowed it whole. She breathed deeply, tasting the iron in the air, steadying herself against the nausea that threatened to pull her into despair. Her hands moved on their own, binding, soothing, pressing life back into those who clung to it desperately. Yet the faces of the fallen lingered. She knelt beside a young soldier, his chest broken, his eyes staring at nothing. In them, she saw a future erased. Letters he would never write, songs he would never hear, a love he would never know. And in that recognition, a hollow ache blossomed in her chest. She had come to this place to heal, to offer hope, yet the weight of so much loss pressed down upon her. She realized that no herb, no poultice, no prayer could undo what had been done. The dead were a silent army, a testimony to the futility of her efforts, and she felt herself trembling beneath the enormity of it. The cries of the wounded began to blend with the moans of the dying, forming a dirge that wrapped itself around her soul. Every wound she treated was a battle she could not win. Every pulse she steadied a temporary victory against a tide of sorrow. She looked up to see the sky gray and heavy, clouds hanging low as if mourning the carnage below. The wind carried the scent of smoke and damp earth, brushing against her face like the hands of ghosts. And yet, despite the despair, she could not stop. To stop would be to surrender, to abandon those who still clung to life by the thinnest of threads. A man groaned beside her, eyes wide, lips moving in a silent plea. She pressed a cloth to his face, whispering words of reassurance, feeling his ragged breath against her hands. She could not promise him survival, no one could, but she could promise her presence, the unwavering steadiness of someone who would not turn away. And in that promise, she discovered a fragile resilience, a quiet defiance against the devastation that surrounded them. But as she moved from one wounded soldier to the next, she could not shake the faces of the fallen. Each one stared at her from the mud and the blood, each one a ghost that clung to her heart. Young men who had once dreamed of honor, of home, of love, now lay silent, their potential snuffed out like candles in a storm. She pressed her fingers to the brow of a boy no older than 16 and felt the strange, hollow ache of despair settle deep within her. Once, she had been a symbol of hope, a light in the darkness. But here, she understood that hope alone could not stand against the tide of death. The battlefield stretched endlessly, a canvas of grief painted in crimson and shadow. She moved steadily, deliberately, offering comfort where she could, dignity where she could not. Each wound she bound was a rebellion against the chaos, a silent testament that life, however fragile, persisted. Yet, even as she worked, the weight of sorrow pressed upon her, a reminder that war did not create victors, only survivors. And survivors bore a terrible inheritance. Memory. The memory of those who had fallen, of laughter never shared, of songs never sung. Finally, as the light began to wane, the cries diminished to weak groans, the battlefield settling into a haunted quiet, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The air was thick with smoke, mud, and sorrow. Yet in the midst of it all, she saw something like a fragile dawn. In the eyes of the living, a spark remained, tiny but resolute, a reminder that life persisted, even against the most relentless shadow. She rose slowly, shoulders aching, hands trembling, yet her gaze remained steady, fixed on the horizon where the next challenge awaited. She understood now, with a clarity carved by suffering, that her role was not to conquer, not to triumph, but to endure, to bear witness, to carry the stories of the fallen into the hearts of those who remained. War would rage, blood would spill, lives would be stolen, But she, and those like her, would endure, carrying memory as both burden and beacon. And in that quiet understanding, she stepped forward, her shadow stretching long across the blood-soaked earth, moving toward the uncertain light of what was yet to come. The fire roared in the hearth, orange tongues licking the blackened walls of the forge. Sparks leapt like fireflies into the heavy darkness, settling in the thick smoke that hung, stubborn and suffocating, over the anvil. A hammer rose and fell with relentless precision, each clang of metal on metal echoing like a drumbeat through the workshop, a rhythm older than memory itself. The blacksmith's hands, rough as weathered stone, moved with the certainty of someone who had known fire and iron since the first thought of creation. Every strike carried weight, not just of steel, but of purpose, pride, and a faith in something noble. He shaped swords for the soldiers who would march under banners, armor that would bear the brunt of the enemy's wrath, shields that would cling to hope like a fragile second skin. His sweat soaked into the leather apron, streaked black and red with soot, and yet he worked as though the forge itself were a cathedral, each hammerfall a prayer, each curve of steel a hymn to courage. In his mind, he was a silent guardian, a creator of protection, a quiet architect of life amidst the chaos of war. The first sword he lifted from the anvil gleamed faintly in the dim torchlight, sharp and sure, a promise of defense. He turned it over in his hands, listening to the metallic whisper, feeling its pulse as if the steel breathed beneath his fingertips. "This will save them," he murmured to himself, the words swallowed by the roar of the furnace. And for a long time he believed it. He believed that each weapon forged was a lifeline, each plate of armor a shield against the inevitable tide of death that pressed against the kingdom. Pride sat heavy in his chest, an invisible weight that pressed him forward day after day, blow after blow. But the rhythm of war is relentless, and time is a cruel master. Weeks bled into months, months into years, and the blacksmith began to hear of the soldiers who carried his creations. He listened first with detached interest, the reports of victory and defeat passing over him like smoke curling toward the rafters. But then names became faces, faces became bodies. The first arrived in fragments, a hand missing a finger, a shield crushed under the weight of betrayal, a sword snapped in the heat of battle. And beneath the metal, beneath the fire and sweat, a new voice stirred, a voice he had tried to silence, claiming it was the price of duty, the necessity of survival. It was a child's voice at first, a messenger, pale and trembling, spoke of men who had not returned, of armor pierced, of the bright gleam of steel turned against flesh. The blacksmith felt it in the pit of his stomach, a cold coil tightening, dragging him into a darkness deeper than any shadow cast by his forge. He began to see the fruits of his labor not as triumphs, but as instruments of death. Every hammerfall, once a hymn, now sounded like a tolling bell, counting the dead. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, he walked along the river that cut through the village, its waters murmuring secrets only the wind could carry. He passed the graves of soldiers, simple stones etched with names, dates, and the faint hope of remembrance. He imagined the weapons he had made clutched in lifeless hands, shields fallen aside, swords now silent. The pride he had carried in his chest dissolved into ash, leaving guilt in its place, heavy and unyielding. The forge behind him glimmered with heat and promise, but now it was a furnace of remorse. He returned, night after night, to the glowing hearth, yet the rhythm of the hammer now felt hollow. Steel bent under his hand, refusing to hold the shape he demanded. Sparks rose, but they no longer danced like fireflies. They fell like tears into the blackened dust. The blacksmith tried to ignore it, tried to immerse himself in work, but the faces of the fallen haunted the shadows of the workshop. He could see the glint of his own creations in their eyes, the weight of metal pressing down where life had once thrummed. The forge was no longer a cathedral. It was a confessional, and he was the sole penitent. He remembered the first time he had witnessed battle. From the hilltop, he had seen men fall like wheat under scythe, the air thick with dust, blood, and smoke. It had been awe-inspiring, terrifying, and for a moment, he thought it beautiful heroism carved in red. But as the years passed, that vision grew sharper, harsher. Beauty dissolved into horror, and the blacksmith realized that he had been complicit. Each sword, each shield, each set of armor he had labored over with care and reverence had been transformed in the hands of war into instruments of death. The hands that forged life-saving protection had instead forged despair. He began to understand the subtle tyranny of responsibility. War was not a distant storm. It was a torrent that swept through the village, through the kingdom, through the very heart of the man who believed himself a silent guardian. He had given the soldiers the means to fight, but he could not choose how the world wielded them. Pride, he saw, is a cruel companion, leading the mind into blind faith. And yet, in the same breath, he felt the fragile seed of something else. Awareness. Perhaps guilt, tempered by understanding, could grow into something like redemption. Perhaps the forge could become a place not just of creation, but of reckoning. One night, he stayed late, long after the village had fallen silent. The fire glowed orange and red, the smoke curling like serpents toward the rafters. He held a sword, warm from the anvil, and ran his fingers along its edge. For the first time, he whispered not of protection, not of glory, but of life, of the men who had laughed, dreamed, and fallen, of the families left behind. He spoke their names aloud, and the echoes of the forge carried them into the night, mingling with the wind, the smoke, and the river beyond. And as he hammered again, slower now, more deliberate, he understood that every act, however small, ripples through the lives of others. He would forge, yes, but with a new weight, a new consciousness. The hammer's song could no longer be a hymn to pride alone. It must carry sorrow, hope, and memory, binding them in the steel. Each weapon would tell a story not of power but of responsibility. And in that understanding, the blacksmith found a quiet, fragile peace. The forge glimmered one last time as dawn crept through the smoke-darkened windows. Light spilled over the anvil, glinting off tools, metal, and sweat-slicked hands. The blacksmith paused, feeling the warmth of the fire against the chill of the morning, and for a fleeting moment, he saw not a weapon, not a soldier, not a battlefield, but a chance. A chance to shape not only steel but conscience. The world outside was relentless and brutal, but within the forge, he could begin again, shaping with care, with knowledge, with remembrance. And in that silence, filled only with the hum of coals and the occasional drip of molten metal, he wondered, could the hand that creates death also create understanding? Could pride, once tempered by grief, become something else entirely? The forge waited for his answer, the hammer poised, the fire ready, and in that quiet, he realized the journey of responsibility had only just begun. The river murmured beyond the walls, carrying whispers of those lost and those yet to be, and the blacksmith's eyes caught the first glimmer of hope, a reflection not of steel, but of something deeper, something unbroken. Tomorrow the forge would call again, but he would answer differently. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the dark. Shadows leapt across the cold stone walls of the inn, dancing like spirits disturbed. A bard sat alone, his back hunched, the lute resting heavily on his knees. His fingers hovered over the strings, trembling not with fear, but with memory. The room was quiet, save for the occasional groan of the wind through the rafters. Outside, the night pressed close, a velvet darkness punctuated by the distant howl of wolves. He drew a deep breath, and the first note trembled into the air, fragile, hesitant, like the heartbeat of a dying world. He began to strum, weaving a melody that rose and fell like the tides of battle. The song was bright at first, a story of shining armor and banners waving in triumph. He sang of kings whose names would echo through centuries, of knights whose swords carved legends into the air. Each chord struck like the clash of steel, each vibration carrying the glory of conquest. The thunder of hooves on cobblestone roads, the thunderous roar of victory. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the hollows beneath his eyes, the marks of nights spent listening to the world's sorrows. But then the melody shifted. A minor chord slipped in, subtle and aching, and with it, the bard's thoughts turned. He thought of the men who fell before they reached the battlefield, young soldiers with mud-caked boots and dreams heavier than their armor. He remembered the mothers who clutched their children close, praying that the distant clash of swords would pass them by. The villagers, trapped in the smoke of burning homes, the cries that would never reach a king's ear. With each pluck of the string, their faces emerged in the shadows, pale and silent, their stories unclaimed by history. His hands moved faster now, not with joy, but with a desperate urgency. The music became a lament, a slow, aching tide that rolled over the stone floors, seeping into the corners of the room. He sang of families torn apart, fathers whose hands were empty of their sons, sisters who wept in the dark. He sang of those buried beneath rubble, swallowed by the earth or the fire, whose names were never carved in stone. The melody wept in minor keys, hollow and resonant, echoing off the walls as if the inn itself listened, understanding. The bard paused, letting the strings hum softly beneath his fingers. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he was there, among the forgotten. The wind seemed to carry whispers, the ghosts of those who had no voice in the annals of kings. He imagined the civilians hiding in cellars, the wounded crawling through mud, the children clutching ragged dolls, their faces streaked with ash. He felt the weight of each unmarked grave, each story untold, each life consumed by the relentless march of ambition and steel. A sigh escaped his lips, low and mournful. History, he realized, was a tapestry woven from the threads of victory, the banners of the triumphant flying high. But beneath those threads lay a shadowed pattern, the hidden weft of suffering and silence. The soldiers celebrated in poems and monuments were only one part of the story. Moonlight spills across the ruined courtyard, pale and brittle, painting the frost-laden stones with a ghostly sheen. The arches, once proud and towering, crumble into themselves, jagged shadows slanting across the uneven ground. Beneath them, children huddle, small and fragile against the vast emptiness, their breaths curling like smoke in the cold night air. They are the remnants of a life that once had warmth, the echoes of laughter long since swallowed by the silence of broken walls. Each face is etched with hunger, yet each pair of eyes holds a stubborn glimmer, a stubborn refusal to vanish entirely, even as the night presses closer. A girl kneels by the base of a weathered pillar, her fingers tracing the rough surface as though she could pull sustenance from the stone itself. She closes her eyes, pressing her palm as if it were a loaf of warm bread, imagining its scent rising into the hollow of her nose. The illusion does not satisfy her body, but it steadies her heart. Around her, the whispers of the children drift like fragile incense, prayers carried in quiet tones, half-spoken hopes that their absent mothers and fathers can somehow hear them. They speak of siblings lost to disease, to hunger, to the cold night, of stolen meals, scraps scavenged from the mud, of nights that stretch endlessly beneath an uncaring sky. Every murmur is a thread, binding them to one another, a tapestry of survival stitched with fear and love in equal measure. The wind moves through the tattered banners clinging to the broken towers, carrying the distant scent of smoke from hearths they are not allowed to approach. The banners flap, whispering the secrets of a forgotten power, symbols of dominion that now serve only to remind the children of what was and what can never return. Somewhere beyond the walls, a lone owl marks the passage of time with a mournful call, its eyes glinting like stars reflected in the frost-fractured puddles. The puddle itself mirrors the heavens, its surface cracked into a mosaic of light and shadow. Even here, in the heart of desolation, beauty persists, fragile, ephemeral, a reminder that the world still breathes. One boy edges closer to the puddle, dragging a thin, frayed cloak around his shoulders. His reflection shivers in the broken ice as he studies the sky. He points with a trembling finger to a cluster of stars and whispers a story of warriors who once strode beneath that same firmament, of castles that touched the clouds, of songs that carried across valleys in the wind. The other children lean closer, their bodies pressed together for warmth, ears hungry for the tales that fill the emptiness where food cannot. In their imagination, the frost loses its bite, and for a heartbeat, they are warriors themselves, strong, fierce, invincible against the cruelty that waits beyond the courtyard walls. A sudden scuff of movement draws the children's gaze to the shadows. A figure stirs near the archway, a child older than the rest, perhaps 14, carrying a bundle of soggy rags and brittle straw. She moves with care, avoiding the frozen puddles, her steps echoing against stone like distant thunder.